The courtroom smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a sterile blend that clung to the back of her throat. The air conditioner hummed too loudly, or maybe the silence was just that heavy. She sat at the long mahogany table with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the divorce papers as if they belonged to someone else. Her name was printed there in sharp black ink, every letter final, every line a blade cutting through the last threads of a life she had once believed in. Across from her, her husband didn't look at her. He scrolled through his phone with the bored impatience of a man waiting for a delayed flight. 2 years of betrayal reduced to a scheduling inconvenience. Her lawyer whispered something about signatures. She nodded without hearing him. Exhaustion had seeped into her bones months ago and never left. It lived behind her eyes in the slow drag of her breath, in the quiet numbness that kept her upright. If she allowed herself to feel everything at once, she knew she would collapse, so she didn't feel. She existed. She moved her hand. She picked up the pen. The metal felt cold and strangely heavy between her fingers. The judge spoke. Her husband signed first, his strokes quick and decisive. When the papers slid toward her, the room tilted slightly. She blinked, thinking it was the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished table. Her vision blurred at the edges. The black ink on the page began to swim, letters dissolving into shapeless shadows. A pressure built behind her temples, a deep throbbing that pulsed with her heartbeat. She tried to inhale and found the air too thin. Someone said her name. It sounded far away. The pen slipped from her fingers. The last thing she saw was her husband looking up, irritation flashing across his face as if her weakness were a personal insult. Then the floor rushed up to meet her, and the world snapped into darkness. When she opened her eyes, the light was blinding. White tiles spun above her in a slow carousel. The air smelled different here, sharper, cleaner. Her mouth tasted metallic. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Pain throbbed behind her forehead. She tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pressed her shoulder back down. "Please don't move," a calm voice said. A woman leaned into view, dark hair tied neatly back, a white coat framing a face lined with practiced kindness. "You fainted. You're in the hospital." The word fainted echoed uselessly in her mind. The courtroom returned in fragments. The papers, the pen, the look on his face. "The divorce," she whispered. "Can wait," the doctor replied softly. She held a clipboard against her chest, and something in her expression shifted. Professional calm layered over something more cautious. "We ran some tests to make sure everything was all right. Your blood pressure was very low. That explains the collapse, but we found something else." A cold knot formed in her stomach. "What?" The doctor's hand rested lightly on her arm, grounding. "You're pregnant. About 8 weeks." The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. Pregnant. 8 weeks. Her mind rejected them at first. It was a mistake. It had to be. She hadn't touched her husband in months, not after the final betrayal had shattered whatever was left between them. The timeline didn't fit. It couldn't. Then memory crept in, unwelcome and hazy. A club pulsing with music. Glass after glass pressed into her hand by a laughing friend. A stranger's eyes across the room, dark and intent. The warmth of his hand at her waist. The blur of dancing. A feeling of being held, of safety wrapped in danger. After that, fragments. A kiss. The scent of smoke and cologne. Blank space. Her stomach twisted. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." The door burst open before the doctor could answer. Her husband stormed in, suit jacket flaring behind him, anger already sharpening his features. "What the hell is going on?" His gaze snapped to the doctor, then to the monitor beside the bed. Understanding dawned, and with it, fury. "You're pregnant." The word was a weapon in his mouth. The doctor stepped between them, firm. "Sir, this is a private." "Who is he?" he demanded, ignoring her. His eyes bored into his wife's face, searching for guilt, for leverage. "You were cheating on me before we even signed the papers." Something inside her recoiled, then hardened. She felt the doctor's presence at her side, steady and warm, but the humiliation burned hotter than the hospital lights. She pushed herself upright despite the dizziness. "Get out," she said quietly. He laughed, a brittle sound. "You think this doesn't matter? You think the judge won't care that you got pregnant by another man during our marriage? I'll use this. I'll take everything." Fear slid icy fingers down her spine. Not for herself, but for the tiny, impossible life the doctor had just named. A child already being turned into a bargaining chip. Her hands curled into the sheets. She met his gaze and felt a strange clarity settle over her. "You're not touching this," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "You're not touching me or this baby ever again. Get out." For a heartbeat, he looked as if he might argue, might spit something cruel enough to scar. Then his eyes flicked to the doctor, to the nurses gathering in the doorway, to the witnesses. His jaw tightened. He turned and left, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the frame. Silence followed. The doctor's hand returned to her shoulder, gentle. "Are you okay?" She stared at the ceiling, at the spinning white tiles that were finally slowing. 8 weeks, a stranger, a child growing inside her in the ruins of a marriage. Terror and wonder tangled in her chest until she couldn't separate them. Slowly, instinctively, her hand drifted to her abdomen. There was nothing to feel yet. No movement, just the knowledge. Her life had collapsed in a courtroom, but something else had risen from the rubble. "I'm keeping it," she whispered. The words surprised her with their certainty. The doctor smiled, a quiet approval that needed no commentary. And as fear continued to coil around her future, another feeling pushed back just as strongly. Resolve. Whoever the father was, whatever war her ex-husband tried to wage, this child was hers. She would not let the world turn it into a weapon. For the first time since she'd picked up that pen, she felt something that wasn't numbness. It was fragile and terrifying and alive. Hope. She did not sleep that night. The hospital discharge papers lay folded on the table beside her bed like a warning she could not unread. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ultrasound screen glowing in the dark, that tiny shape floating in black space. Proof that her life had already changed beyond repair, or beyond salvation. She could not tell which. Her apartment felt unfamiliar, as if she had stepped into a version of it that belonged to another woman. A woman who was not alone inside her own skin anymore. A woman being watched by the future. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, the city fell quiet. The traffic faded. The air thickened with heat and salt. And she finally drifted into a shallow sleep filled with fractured memories of music and a stranger's hands steady at her waist. The knock came just before sunrise, heavy, deliberate, a sound that did not belong to neighbors or delivery men. It carried intention, and her eyes snapped open with her heart already racing. For a moment she thought it was her ex-husband returning to finish what he started, to threaten her again, to turn her fear into leverage. She sat up slowly, every instinct telling her not to answer. The knock came again, 3 sharp strikes that echoed through the apartment, and something colder slipped into her chest. Curiosity mixed with dread. She walked to the door on trembling legs and looked through the peephole. The man on the other side stood perfectly still, as if he had been carved there, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black despite the heat, tattoos climbing his forearm like dark vines. His head tilted slightly as though he could sense her watching him. And when he lifted his eyes to the door, she felt recognition hit her like a physical force. The club returned in a rush of sound and light, the music vibrating through her ribs, his hands guiding her through the crowd, the feeling of being anchored in chaos. She staggered back from the door, breath caught in her throat. It was him. She should not have opened it. Every rational thought screamed that truth, but her hand moved anyway. The chain slid free. The door opened a fraction, and the air between them thickened instantly. Up close, he looked more dangerous in the quiet morning light, his green eyes steady and unreadable. But there was no aggression in his posture, only focus, a terrifying calm. He spoke her name softly, not a question but a certainty, and the sound of it in his voice made her pulse stumble. He said he knew about the hospital, about the pregnancy, and the words landed with surgical precision. She demanded how, demanded who he was, but he did not step forward, did not try to enter. He waited as if giving her the choice, and in that waiting she felt something stranger than fear. She felt seen. He introduced himself simply, Raphael, no last name, no explanation, yet the name carried weight. She could feel it in the way silence formed around it. He told her he had come because responsibility did not disappear with memory, because whatever happened that night now lived in her body, and that made it his concern, not ownership, not control, concern. He offered protection with the calm of a man discussing weather, as if danger were a constant he had already measured and accepted, and the certainty in his voice unsettled her more than any threat could. She realized he was not asking permission to care. He had already decided. Her first instinct was refusal, pride rising like armor. She told him she did not need saving, that she had survived worse alone, but he did not argue. He only nodded and said survival and safety were not the same thing, and the quiet truth of that cracked something open in her chest. She saw then that he was not trying to enter her life by force. He was standing at the edge of it, holding a door she could walk through or slam shut. Behind him, the city began to wake. Distant engines, early voices, light creeping over rooftops. And she stood in her doorway, suspended between two futures. One she understood filled with struggle and isolation, the other shadowed by a man whose presence felt like standing near a storm that promised shelter and destruction in the same breath. And as her hand drifted unconsciously to her abdomen, she understood that the choice was no longer only hers. When she finally stepped aside and let the door open wider, the air shifted. The moment sealed itself, and in the silence that followed, she felt the first true tremor of suspense ripple through her bones. Not fear of him, but fear of how deeply her life had already begun to intertwine with his. And somewhere beneath that fear, a fragile spark ignited. The dangerous possibility that the stranger from one forgotten night was about to become the axis her entire world would turn around. The courthouse looked different the second time she walked in, the air thicker, heavier, as if the building itself remembered her collapse and was waiting to see if she would break again. But she did not feel fragile now. Fear still lived in her chest, but it had hardened into something sharper, something that kept her spine straight as she stepped beside Raphael and the lawyer he had sent, a man with silver hair and eyes that measured everything in silence. Her ex-husband was already there. Seated with a confidence that felt rehearsed, his gaze slid toward her and then toward Raphael. And in that single glance she saw calculation replace anger. He was trying to understand the power standing next to her, trying to measure it like a weapon he might have to fight. The hearing began with voices that sounded distant and formal, papers sliding across polished wood, the judge reading statements that turned her private pain into legal language. But beneath the calm surface, she felt tension coiling tighter with every breath. Her ex-husband's lawyer rose and began to speak about morality, about betrayal, about the pregnancy that supposedly proved her character. The words were polished and cruel, meant to cut quietly, meant to shame her into shrinking. But before the damage could settle, her own lawyer stood, and the temperature in the room shifted. Documents appeared like controlled explosions, bank transfers, apartment leases, proof of years of deception laid out with surgical precision. And she watched her ex-husband's face lose color as his own secrets were dragged into the light. Raphael did not move during any of it. He sat still beside her like a shadow carved into flesh. But she felt his presence like a shield, steady and unyielding. Every time the tension rose, his hand brushed lightly against the back of her chair. Not possession, not display, only a reminder that she was not alone. And that small gesture held her together when the accusations grew louder, when her ex-husband finally stood and snapped, calling her reckless, unstable, unfit. His voice cracked with desperation, and the judge's expression hardened. The sound of the gavel silenced him with brutal finality. The verdict came like thunder contained in a whisper. Assets returned, compensation ordered, the pregnancy dismissed as irrelevant to the dissolution. Each word stripped him of control piece by piece, and she felt something inside her loosen that had been knotted for years. Not victory, not joy, but release. The courtroom faded into a blur of movement as people stood, gathered papers, spoke in hushed tones. And through it all, her ex-husband stared at her with a hatred that was almost childish in its helplessness. He had lost the one thing he valued most, power over her. When they stepped outside the courthouse, the city air felt electric, sunlight flashing off windows, traffic roaring like distant applause. Her knees trembled, and she did not know if it was from relief or the echo of everything she had survived to reach this moment. Raphael turned to her then, and his eyes softened in a way that felt private despite the chaos around them. He did not congratulate her, did not celebrate. He simply looked at her as if acknowledging a battle fought and won. And in that silent recognition, she understood something terrifying and beautiful. The war with her past was ending, but another war was forming around them. Quieter, darker, tied to the man who stood at her side. Across the street, she saw her ex-husband watching, phone pressed to his ear, eyes locked on Raphael with a promise of retaliation that needed no words. And a cold certainty slid into her bones that this was not over. The courtroom had ended one chapter, but opened a door into something far more dangerous. She felt her hand move to her abdomen instinctively, protecting the life inside her. And for the first time, the question of the father was no longer abstract suspense, but a living storm gathering on the horizon. Because whoever Raphael truly was, whatever world he carried behind those calm green eyes, she had just stepped into it willingly. And there was no returning to the woman she had been before the collapse. The city looked endless from the height of the hill, a river of lights stretching into the dark like veins glowing beneath skin. And the wind carried the smell of salt and asphalt and distant rain. She stood at the edge of the overlook with her arms wrapped around herself, feeling the night press close. Raphael was beside her but not touching, his silence heavier than words. He had brought her here without explanation, only a message telling her to trust him, and she had come because something inside her already did. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The city hummed below as if unaware of the storm gathering between them. She felt it in the way he breathed, measured and controlled, the way his gaze never settled on one place, always scanning, always calculating. And she realized that this quiet was not peace for him. It was restraint, a leash pulled tight around something dangerous. Finally, he turned toward her and the wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and leather and the metallic edge of tension. He said her name softly, and the sound of it was an apology before the words came. He told her that everything she believed about him was incomplete, that the man who stood beside her was not just a businessman or a protector stepping in by chance. He spoke without drama, without pride, only truth, and that truth landed like a weight in her chest. He said he ruled things that did not exist on paper, that his world operated in shadows where laws bent and broke. Where loyalty was currency and fear was architecture, he did not dress it up as noble. He did not ask forgiveness. He simply laid it between them like a blade and waited to see if she would pick it up or walk away. Her first instinct was to step back, to create distance from the gravity of what he was confessing. But her feet stayed rooted, because as he spoke, she saw something else beneath the danger, exhaustion, years of carrying violence like armor. He told her about the streets that raised him, about hunger that carved intelligence into survival, about losing a mother who could not afford to be sick, about a sister he refused to lose to the same world. And in those fragments, she saw the boy buried inside the man. A child who learned power because weakness cost lives. The wind rose, whipping her hair across her face, and she realized her fear had changed shape. It was no longer fear of him, but fear for him. Fear of the life that would always circle him like wolves. She asked why he was telling her this, why he was risking her seeing the truth when lies would have been safer. And his answer came without hesitation, because you are already part of my future, and I will not build a future on deception. The certainty in his voice cracked something open inside her. She moved closer without thinking, close enough to feel the heat of him, and when his hand lifted, it hovered in the air as if asking permission. She nodded before she understood she had decided. His fingers brushed her cheek with a tenderness that did not match the man he claimed to be, and that contradiction made her chest ache. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to refuse, but she did not refuse. Their lips met and the city vanished. The kiss was not desperate or violent. It was steady, grounding. A promise spoken in breath instead of language. When they separated, her pulse roared in her ears, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes that frightened her more than any threat. He whispered that he had tried to stay away after that night, that he knew a woman like her deserved a safer world. But the thought of her living in it without him had become unbearable. She felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. She should have run then, should have chosen distance and safety. But instead she reached for him again, because safety without him suddenly felt empty. Somewhere below, a siren cut through the night, and he stiffened, instinct snapping back into place. His gaze flicked to the city, and she saw the war he carried return to the surface. He pulled his phone from his pocket, and the moment shattered. His voice turned cold as steel as he answered, listening, asking sharp questions. And when he hung up, the darkness in his expression was unmistakable. "They found one of my warehouses," he said quietly, and the calm in his tone was more terrifying than anger. This was not a surprise to him. It was inevitability arriving on schedule. He looked at her then, and something softer fought through the tension. "I need to move you somewhere safe, now." She felt the ground tilt under her feet, the kiss still burning on her lips, the confession still echoing in her chest, and the future she had just chosen unfolding into danger faster than she could breathe. As he took her hand and led her back toward the car, she understood with brutal clarity that loving Raphael meant stepping into a storm that would never fully pass. But as his fingers tightened around hers, she also understood something else. She was no longer standing at the edge of his world. She was already inside it. And the only question left was whether she would survive the fire or become part of it. The penthouse did not feel like a home when the doors sealed behind her. It felt like the inside of a vault suspended above the city, walls of glass looking out over a skyline that glittered with false calm. She could see headlights flowing like rivers far below, and wondered how a world so alive could feel so distant. Raphael moved through the space with quiet efficiency, speaking into his phone in a language of clipped commands and coded names. And she realized that safety in his world was built from tension, not comfort. Every corner guarded, every shadow watched. Two men stood outside the main door without speaking, their presence heavy as locked steel, and she felt the reality of her situation settle into her skin. She was being protected because she was a target now, not because of what she had done, but because of who stood beside her. The weight of that knowledge pressed against her ribs. Raphael finally ended the call and turned to her, the hardness in his face softening just enough to let her breathe. He told her she would stay here until the situation stabilized, that no one would reach her, that he would burn the city down before he let harm touch her or the child, and the intensity of that promise made her heart stutter. She walked toward the window and placed her palm against the glass, cool and unyielding. The city lights reflected back at her like a stranger's eyes. She tried to imagine returning to her small apartment, to quiet mornings and ordinary fear. But that life already felt like a dream fading at the edges. Behind her, she heard Raphael approach, and the air shifted with his presence. He did not touch her immediately. He simply stood close enough that she felt anchored. He said her name softly and asked if she regretted stepping into his world. The question carried no accusation, only vulnerability, and she surprised herself by answering without hesitation that regret required choice, and she had already chosen. The silence that followed was fragile and electric. He rested his hand gently over hers on the glass, and she felt the tremor he tried to hide. This was a man who did not fear bullets or betrayal but feared losing her, and that knowledge carved through her remaining doubt. She turned toward him and saw exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. The night had taken pieces of him and would continue to do so until there was nothing left or until he forced it to stop. She lifted her hand to his cheek, and the contact was quiet but absolute. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat as if absorbing strength from the touch. A sharp crack shattered the moment, distant but unmistakable, gunfire echoing across the city like thunder split in half. Raphael's eyes opened instantly, predator awareness replacing softness. He stepped away from the window and pulled her with him, guiding her toward the center of the room with controlled urgency. Another burst followed closer this time, and she felt fear surge through her body in a cold wave. He spoke into his phone again, voice low and lethal, confirming positions, ordering retaliation. Every word a reminder that violence was not an interruption in his life. It was the rhythm of it. She sat on the edge of the sofa, gripping her abdomen as if she could shield the life inside her with her hands. The baby was suddenly real in a way nothing else had made it. Not the hospital, not the courtroom, but this danger humming in the air. Raphael crouched in front of her and took her wrists gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. He told her to breathe, that this was noise, not threat, that his enemies barked louder than they bit. But she saw the truth flicker behind his reassurance. This was escalation. And escalation meant blood. Minutes stretched into something shapeless until the phone fell silent and the city returned to its artificial calm. Raphael exhaled slowly as if releasing a blade he had been holding between his teeth. He told her it was handled for now, that the message had been answered, but the war had crossed a line and would not retreat easily. She looked at him and understood that this was the future she had stepped into. Nights punctured by violence, mornings stitched together with promises. And yet beneath the terror, a fierce clarity took root. She reached for his hand and pressed it against her stomach, the gesture instinctive and unplanned. His fingers stilled there and his expression changed, the storm inside him quieting at the contact. In that moment, he was not a boss or a weapon or a man carved from shadow. He was a father in the making, terrified of losing what he had not yet held. She told him they would survive this, that fear did not get to own their story. And as he leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, she felt the truth settle between them like a vow. Outside, the city continued to glow indifferent to their private war. But inside the penthouse, something stronger than fear began to form. A bond forged in the knowledge that danger would never leave them and love had chosen them anyway. And for the first time since the gunfire faded, she realized that the real suspense was not whether the world would attack again. It was whether they could build a life sturdy enough to stand in the crossfire and still call it home. The morning arrived without softness, sunlight cutting through the glass walls of the penthouse like a blade instead of warmth. She had not truly slept, only drifted in and out of shallow dreams where footsteps echoed and doors never stayed closed. Raphael stood near the window, speaking quietly into his phone, his voice low and controlled, but she could hear the tension threaded through every word. It vibrated in the air like a wire pulled too tight. When he ended the call, he stayed still for a moment, staring out at the city, as if calculating how much of it he would have to burn to keep her safe. She rose from the bed and crossed the room barefoot, the marble floor cold beneath her feet, grounding her in reality. When she touched his arm, he turned instantly, instinct shifting to tenderness the moment he saw her. But the softness in his eyes could not fully mask the storm underneath. She asked what he was not telling her, and he hesitated, that single pause heavier than any answer. He said her ex-husband had made a move, not in court, not through lawyers, but through money, alliances. Whispers in dark rooms, where her name was now currency. The words settled into her chest with a sickening clarity. Diego had found a way to enter Raphael's world, had paid enemies to tighten the circle, not because he understood the danger, but because he wanted to prove he still held power over her life. The childish cruelty of it made her stomach twist. She imagined him sitting in some office smiling while strangers with guns discussed her existence like a strategy. Fear rose sharp and immediate, but anger followed just as fast, hotter and steadier. Raphael watched her absorb the truth, and she saw the guilt flicker across his face. As if her danger was a debt he owed, he told her he would end it quickly, that Diego had crossed into territory where mercy did not apply. The calm certainty in his tone chilled her more than the threat itself. She grabbed his hand before he could step away, her fingers tightening with desperation. She told him no, that she would not trade one monster for another. That killing Diego would not protect the baby. It would poison the future they were trying to build. For a moment, the room held its breath. Raphael's jaw clenched, the war inside him visible in the rigid line of his body. Violence was the language he knew best, and she was asking him to speak something foreign. He looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. She repeated herself more softly this time, not pleading but commanding with a quiet strength she did not know she possessed. She said their child would not grow up in a story written in blood. He had to find another way. Silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Then his shoulders lowered a fraction, the decision settling into him like a stone dropped into deep water. He nodded once, the gesture small but monumental. He would not kill Diego. He would dismantle him instead, strip his resources, expose his corruption, leave him powerless and breathing. And she felt relief flood her body so intensely her knees almost gave out. The victory was fragile and brief, because at that exact moment the penthouse security alarm chirped once, a soft electronic sound that did not belong in peace. Raphael's head snapped toward the door, every muscle in his body tightening. His phone lit up in his hand before it rang. The message short and brutal, movement detected on the lower floors. Unknown entry. Her pulse roared in her ears as reality crashed back over them. He moved instantly, guiding her behind him with one arm while dialing commands with the other. Voices answered on the other end, sharp and urgent. She could hear footsteps outside the apartment, heavy and coordinated, not the guards she recognized. Raphael pushed her toward a reinforced door she had not noticed before, hidden in the wall like a secret. He told her to go inside and lock it, to stay silent no matter what she heard. His eyes held hers for a fraction of a second, and in that look she saw everything he was afraid to say. She stepped into the safe room, and the door sealed with a mechanical hiss. The world reduced to the pounding of her heart and the muffled thunder of chaos outside. She pressed her hands to her abdomen and whispered promises she hoped the baby could not yet understand. Gunshots erupted somewhere in the distance, sharp and final, and she realized this was the cost of loving a man like Raphael, every moment suspended between survival and loss. In the darkness, she clung to the memory of his nod that morning, the choice he made for her, for their future, and she understood that the real battle was not just outside those walls, but inside the man she loved, a war between destruction and restraint. And if they survived this day, that war would define the life they built together. The suspense was no longer a question of enemies or escape. It was whether love could be strong enough to hold a man back from the edge and still keep them all alive. The safe room swallowed sound until even her own breathing felt distant. The walls, thick and windowless, painted a neutral gray that erased any sense of time. She sat on the floor with her back pressed against the cold metal door and counted her heartbeats, because it was the only way to keep from screaming. Each distant gunshot vibrated through the structure like a pulse traveling through bone. She imagined Raphael moving through corridors she could not see, his body a weapon in motion. And the thought both terrified and steadied her, because if anyone could hold the line, it was him. Minutes stretched into something shapeless and cruel. The air felt thinner with every second. She whispered to the baby without sound, lips moving in silent promises that tasted like desperation. She promised safety she could not guarantee, a future she could not see. The gunfire faded, gradually leaving behind a ringing emptiness. And that silence frightened her more than the noise, because silence meant aftermath. Silence meant decisions had been made in blood. The lock hissed and her entire body seized. The door opened a fraction and Raphael stepped inside, his shirt torn at the shoulder, a dark stain spreading across the fabric that her mind refused to name at first. He closed the door quickly and dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands framing her face as if confirming she was real. She touched his chest and her fingers came away wet. The metallic smell hit her, and the truth followed. Blood not his, he said, immediately reading the horror in her eyes. His voice hoarse but steady, not mine. Relief crashed into her so violently she felt dizzy. She leaned into him, and he held her with a grip that bordered on desperate. For a moment the world shrank to the space between their bodies, the echo of survival humming in her veins. He told her it was over for now, the intruders neutralized, the perimeter secured. But the words carried a weight that suggested this was only the beginning of something larger. She asked who they were, and he hesitated just long enough to confirm her worst fear. Someone inside had sold them out. The betrayal settled over her like ice, colder than any gunfire. This was not a faceless enemy, but a fracture within his own circle. Raphael's jaw tightened as he spoke the name, Matteo, the man she had seen at his side more than once, the one who laughed quietly and moved like a shadow, the one Raphael trusted with his life. The idea that loyalty could rot so completely made her stomach twist. She saw the pain flash through Raphael's eyes before it hardened into something lethal. He stood slowly, and she felt the distance return. The man who had just held her dissolving into the leader he had to be. He said he would handle it, and the calm in his voice was a promise of consequences she did not want to imagine. She grabbed his wrist before he could turn away, her fingers trembling but unyielding. She told him not to disappear into that darkness alone. That revenge would not rebuild trust. It would only leave ashes. He looked down at her hand on his skin, and for a heartbeat, the fury inside him wavered. Outside the safe room, the penthouse was eerily still, the aftermath already cleaned with professional efficiency. Guards stood at attention as if violence were a routine interruption. Raphael guided her back into the open space, and she felt the air shift around him. Everyone watched him with a mixture of fear and devotion. He gave a single order and men moved instantly, a hunt already in motion. She realized then that Matteo was not running from police or law. He was running from a ghost that would never stop following. Raphael turned to her once more, and the mask slipped just enough for her to see the man beneath it. He whispered that betrayal cut deeper than bullets, that Matteo had been family, and now he was a wound that had to be cauterized. She stepped closer and pressed her forehead against his chest, listening to the relentless rhythm of his heart. She told him family was not proven in violence, but in what survived it, that he still had a chance to choose how this story ended. His arms closed around her again, and she felt the storm inside him rage and recede all at once. Outside, the city continued its indifferent roar, unaware that loyalties had shattered and war had crossed another invisible line. And in that fragile quiet, she understood the true suspense was no longer whether enemies would come, but whether Raphael could endure the betrayal without becoming something he could never return from. Because the man who walked out that door to find Matteo would decide the future of all three of them, and she could only stand in the wreckage of trust and hope. Love was stronger than vengeance. Night fell heavy and suffocating over the city, the kind of darkness that pressed against the windows like a living thing. She stood alone in the penthouse, watching the reflection of her own face hover over the skyline, pale and hollow-eyed. And she realized she no longer recognized the woman staring back at her. 3 months ago, her fears had been ordinary, bills and heartbreak and loneliness. Now men were hunting each other in her name. Blood had already been spilled in rooms she slept in. And the life inside her was growing in a world sharpened by violence. Her phone remained silent on the table. Raphael had not called, not a message, not a single word. And the silence was worse than any gunfire, because it meant something irreversible was unfolding somewhere beyond her reach. She imagined him walking into darkness with that calm expression. The one that meant decisions had already been made, and every instinct inside her screamed that this night would change him in a way he could not undo. The elevator chimed softly and her body locked in place. She did not breathe as footsteps crossed the marble floor outside. The guards spoke in low voices, and then the door opened. Raphael entered without a word. His clothes were clean, but his face carried the exhaustion of a man who had crossed a line and returned with its weight carved into his bones. She searched him for wounds and found none. But the absence of injury did not bring relief. Something inside him had shifted. He walked toward her slowly, as if unsure how close he was allowed to stand, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. He told her Matteo was alive. The words surprised her enough to steal her breath. He said he could have killed him, and every man in the room expected him to. The betrayal demanded it. The code demanded it. But when the moment came, he heard her voice in his head, telling him their child would not grow up inside a story written in blood. And for the first time in his life, he chose mercy over fear. The confession trembled between them, fragile and immense. She felt tears rise without warning because she understood what it cost him to walk away from vengeance. Mercy was not weakness in his world, it was rebellion. and rebellion carried consequences that would ripple through his empire. He told her Mateo would disappear, exiled, stripped of power but breathing, a living reminder to every man under him that loyalty could not be bought back with death alone. She stepped into him and wrapped her arms around his body, holding him as if she could anchor him to the man he was trying to become. He buried his face against her neck, and she felt the shudder he had been hiding, the release of tension he could not show anyone else. In that embrace, she saw the truth with terrifying clarity. Love had become his battlefield and mercy his weapon, and the world would not forgive him easily for choosing it. When they separated, he rested his hand against her abdomen with reverence that bordered on fear. He whispered that he almost lost himself tonight, that rage had tasted familiar and safe, and it was her voice that dragged him back from the edge. She covered his hand with hers and told him this was what strength looked like. Not the bodies he left behind, but the ones he allowed to live. And he stared at her as if she were rewriting the laws he had lived by since childhood. Outside, the city roared indifferent to their quiet revolution. But inside the penthouse, a new order was forming, one built not on terror but on restraint, and she understood the suspense had shifted again. The enemies beyond their walls were no longer the greatest threat. The real danger was whether his world would accept a leader who chose mercy over fear. Because men who ruled through violence did not step aside gracefully. Raphael looked out over the lights with a gaze that held both certainty and dread. He said tonight was not the end of the war, it was the beginning of a different one. A war inside his own ranks, and she felt the weight of that future settle into her bones. But she did not step away. She moved closer until their shoulders touched, and together they faced the city that might one day try to tear them apart. In the quiet that followed, she realized something astonishing. The man beside her was no longer just protecting her from danger. He was transforming because of her. And transformation was the most dangerous act of all in a world that punished change. Yet as his fingers intertwined with hers, she felt a calm certainty rise through the fear. Whatever storm waited beyond this night, they would meet it together. Not as a boss and a protected woman, but as two people rewriting fate with every breath. And the suspense that lingered in the air was no longer only about survival. It was about whether love could outlast the empire that was beginning to fracture around them. The pain woke her before the sound did, a sharp tearing sensation low in her abdomen that dragged her out of sleep with a gasp. The room was dark except for the city lights bleeding through the glass. For a moment she thought it was another nightmare stitched from fear and memory. But then the pain returned stronger, rhythmic, undeniable. Her hand flew to her stomach and instinct replaced confusion. Something was wrong. The baby was not due for months. This was too early, too violent. Raphael was awake before she spoke. Years of danger had tuned his body to the slightest shift in breath. He turned toward her and saw the terror in her face, saw the way she curled around her abdomen, and the world snapped into focus for him with brutal clarity. He was already on his feet calling for the car before she finished saying the word pain. His voice cut through the penthouse like a blade. Men moved instantly. Doors opened. Footsteps thundered. The machine of his empire reassembled itself around a single purpose. The elevator ride felt endless. Every second stretched thin with dread. She clung to him as another wave of pain ripped through her body, her breath breaking into sharp fragments. He held her with a steadiness that bordered on desperate, whispering promises he could not control but needed to say anyway. The lobby doors burst open, and the night air slammed into them hot and electric. The car door opened, and he lifted her inside as if she weighed nothing. The city blurred past in streaks of light and sirens. Halfway to the hospital, the first explosion hit. The sound was not loud at first, it was pressure, a shock wave that punched the air out of her lungs. The car swerved violently, and Raphael's arm locked around her to keep her from slamming into the door. Glass shattered somewhere behind them. Men shouted through radios. The driver cursed and accelerated. Headlights flooded the road ahead, revealing chaos unfolding in motion. Another vehicle spun across the intersection, blocking their path, masked figures spilling into the street like shadows given shape. Raphael's voice changed, stripped down to command and instinct. He pushed her low against the seat and told her not to move. The door opened and the night exploded into gunfire. The sound tore through her bones. Each shot a hammer against her skull. She covered her abdomen with both hands as if her body could become armor. The pain inside her pulsed in time with the violence outside, life and death colliding in the same breath. Seconds stretched into a lifetime. She heard bodies hit pavement, heard men scream, heard Raphael shouting orders with a fury that felt almost inhuman. And through the chaos, she realized the attack was not random. This was precision. This was a message carved in fire. They were not trying to scare him, they were trying to end him, and she was caught in the center of it. The door ripped open and Raphael was there again, his face streaked with blood that was not his eyes burning with a focus so sharp it frightened her. He lifted her out of the car and carried her through smoke and shattered glass. Another explosion thundered behind them, heat licking her back. The world reduced to the rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear and the pain tearing through her body. They reached another vehicle waiting in the shadows, doors already open, men forming a wall around them. He laid her inside and climbed in after her, shouting the hospital name like a vow. The engine roared and the city began to move again. But the attack had already done its work. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she felt something warm spreading beneath her hands. Terror clawed its way up her throat as she realized it was blood. She looked at him and saw fear for the first time since she had met him, raw and unguarded. The mask of the boss stripped away, leaving only a man terrified of losing everything at once. He pressed his hand over hers against her stomach, whispering, "Stay with me," over and over as if the words could stitch reality back together. The hospital lights appeared ahead like a fragile promise in the darkness, but she understood with a clarity that cut deeper than pain that this night was not just an attack, it was a declaration. The war had crossed into her body, into their child. And whatever enemy had chosen this battlefield had already changed the rules forever. The suspense was no longer about survival of an empire or revenge or power. It was about whether love could endure the moment where everything sacred was placed in the crosshairs. And as the car screamed toward the emergency entrance, she held onto Raphael's voice like a lifeline, praying it would be enough to pull them both through the storm alive. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly under white lights that felt too bright for a world that was falling apart. Voices blurred into a single distant roar as doctors pulled her away from him, hands moving fast, wheels screaming against tile, and Raphael stood frozen for a fraction of a second, as if his body refused to understand separation. Then instinct snapped back, and he followed until a nurse blocked him with a firm palm against his chest. The doors swung closed between them, and the sound of the lock echoed like a gunshot. He stared at the red light above the operating room and felt time dissolve. Every second dragged like broken glass through his lungs. Blood still stained his hands, and he did not wipe it away. He welcomed the pain of it, the reminder that this was real, that she was inside fighting for breath and life, and their child balanced somewhere between existence and memory. Men filled the hallway behind him. His men, silent and armed, the hospital transformed into a fortress, but none of that mattered. Power meant nothing here. Bullets meant nothing. Money meant nothing. All he had was waiting. Inside the room, she floated in and out of consciousness. the world reduced to light and pressure and voices calling her name from very far away. She felt hands on her body, heard the word bleeding, heard the word premature, and fear clawed its way through the fog. She tried to speak, but her mouth would not obey. Her thoughts spiraled toward the only thing that mattered, the baby. She whispered a prayer without sound, a bargain with whatever force ruled the universe. Take anything but not this. The pain rose and fell like a tide pulling her under, and in the space between waves, she saw Raphael's face in her mind, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, the way his hand rested over her stomach as if guarding a treasure he did not deserve but would die to protect. She clung to that image like a rope in darkness. If she let go, she would disappear. The doors burst open at last, and the doctor stepped out, his mask hanging loose around his neck. Raphael moved before the man could speak, the hallway snapping into sharp focus. The doctor's eyes carried exhaustion and something else fragile and cautious. He said the bleeding was controlled. He said she was alive. And Raphael felt the air slam back into his chest so violently he staggered. But the doctor had not finished. "The baby is alive," he said quietly but early and small and fighting. Alive. The word detonated inside him with a force greater than any explosion he had ever survived. He closed his eyes, and the hallway tilted. Relief so intense it bordered on pain tore through him. He gripped the wall to stay upright. His men shifted uneasily around him, unsure whether to celebrate or brace for another blow. But there was no blow, only a fragile miracle breathing somewhere beyond those doors. Hours later, he stood beside her hospital bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Machines hummed softly around them like mechanical lullabies. The incubator rested near the window, glowing faintly. Inside it, a child no bigger than his forearm slept wrapped in wires and light. And yet she was alive, impossibly alive. He reached through the opening and placed one finger against her tiny hand and felt it close around him with a strength that stole his breath. She woke slowly, and her eyes found him immediately, confusion fading into memory and then into tears. He leaned close and told her they survived, told her their daughter was fighting and beautiful and stubborn, just like her mother. She turned her head toward the incubator, and a sound escaped her that was half sob, half laughter. A sound born from terror dissolving into hope. In that quiet room, he understood something with absolute clarity. The war outside would never end. Enemies would always circle. Power would always demand blood. But this child, this woman, this fragile breath between them was the axis of his universe now. He could burn cities and command armies, and none of it would equal the weight of the life sleeping inches away. He bent and pressed his forehead to hers and whispered a promise he had never spoken to anyone, not to protect her with violence, but to build a world where she did not have to fear it. And she believed him because she had watched him choose mercy over rage, watched him stand in fire and come back carrying love instead of ashes. Outside the hospital, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that inside a small room a new empire had been born, not of guns or money or fear, but of survival and devotion. And as their daughter's tiny fingers tightened around his, he felt the final truth settle into his bones. The war had tried to take everything and failed. And from that failure, a family had risen stronger than the darkness that hunted them. And for the first time since the collapse in the courtroom, he allowed himself to imagine a future not ruled by suspense, but by the quiet miracle of still being alive together.